because of the way that the AI buzz is rolled out, there was a bunch of big headline, big investments behind schemes that was very much led by the sea captains, which sounds fantastic at the start. And about now, across lots of different companies, you're hearing where this starts to hit barriers. Because what those people need to do is surround themselves with people who actually understand the reality of what's going on, the reality of where technology currently is, the reality of where the barriers are going to be, so they can start to make some smart choices.
We are speaking with Nick Sherrard about innovation lessons for brands and product teams investing into AI.
Those teams who are making the most progress on AI, the reality is the way that you explore the idea is to make it. And I think one of the things that happens a lot for those of us that come from a kind of design thinking background is you have this big kind of rehearsal state. I think one of the interesting things now is the fact that actually there's quite often ways you can start to actually build out the thing, or at least a small version of the thing, and start to get it working and start to see what the real issues are.
In this episode, we'll be covering topics like top-down and bottom-up approaches to leading AI projects, that the history of art and innovation is the history of rejection, that leaders of AI projects often don't anticipate what's needed, about the problem with design thinking when building AI products, how the creative and consulting worlds are enhanced by AI, and use cases where AI will have impact. Nick Sherrard is a co-founder of Label Sessions, the global innovation expert network, and Label Ventures, the venture studio. He's also a board member of Substrakt, the digital agency, and collective art gallery in Edinburgh. Nick is often said to be the only person to have run an innovation lab inside a bank, a government department, a Big Four consultancy, and a circus. His approach to making change happen in organizations fuses his more classic brand and product development background with the devising mindset of an arts producer. Nick advises boards and entrepreneurs globally.
Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for joining us. You started a brilliant business recently, Label Sessions, which empowers brands to make progress. But why does the market need something like Label Sessions?
The starting point is an old problem, which is companies and actually all kinds of institutions now are trying to make things happen. And I will, in that context, use the word innovation. I think it's a bit of a challenging word, which is why we talk about progress, because I think sometimes innovation in a good way is very open-ended. Whereas I think there are a set of challenges that most organizations are facing into right now, where to some extent they know what the changes look like. But the question is then, how do you make that happen? So those are the questions of, how do you innovate in the world in which AI now exists, but also how do you make your business sustainable in some way? How do you grow in the culture that we have now? And how do you build a successful company that is good for the world? That's the thing we're trying to help people do. And what we do in some ways is the opposite of AI. We connect them to people who are experts in different aspects of the challenge that they're taking on. So that is both people who are leading big change and driving innovation within companies around the world. It's also really incredible creative minds of different kinds. And it's also people who really understand how the technology works in different areas. That's the nature of our expert network. And we connect them, therefore, to brands that are trying to make changes happen.
Very cool. And what types of clients have been using your services?
So it's a mix. So we do, we're really fortunate to work with the very big tech companies and Apple and Google and people like that. But we also work with a lot of companies who are kind of maybe one level below that. So in terms of the individual, financial services firms that are in one country, like a TSB or a Virgin Money. We work with Sabre, a big driver in the travel tech kind of space. And increasingly, actually, we also work with, especially around some of these things around AI, with kind of classic scale-ups. So on a whole range of different areas. So they are, all people who are trying to make something really interesting happen in a brand that sometimes really loves the idea of that, sometimes isn't quite ready for it yet.
We were chatting last week with a product designer, and a big part of that conversation was around the idea that these kind of like small to mid-sized companies really have an opportunity to elevate what they're doing and maybe make a bigger name for themselves in AI because they don't have the rigid constrictions. They're in survival mode. Are you finding that aligns with who your clients have been?
Attitude-wise, they're in the right space to take on some of these challenges. I also think there's a core enabler, which is so much of what we talk about as AI is enabled by data. And that therefore, the other kind of key enabler is either having your data in a good enough structure that it can be used and it can be managed in a sensible way, or being in a structure that enables you to make changes to get it into a structure such that it can be used. There is a fundamental issue in lots of big companies just now, which is they have a lot of data, but their ability to access it and their ability to talk to customers about what the output of those data models is in fact very, very limited. But certainly, I think there's a really interesting opportunity right now for companies that have built a brand, at least in a segment of the market. They're kind of known in a certain space, have the systems that are up and running, have a bit of the finances to be able to make some kind of level of experiments over the coming years, but no longer have the same barriers that would stop them scaling as they did even a couple of years ago.
So on this show, we tend to spend a lot of time diving into how you actually build an AI product. But we have your brilliant mind here today, and I'd really like to understand more about the creative process, the planning process, the innovation process that happens before an AI project gets kicked off. Who is it that's usually making the decision to kick off one of these large-scale projects or one of these new AI initiatives?
I think if we're being honest, there's two types of scenario going on across lots of different industries. And only last week we started using this phrase for it within our team. So I'll just share the same phrase we're using, which is there's either the sea captains or there's the pirates. Now, there are a bunch of sea captains who are already the leaders within the organization, and they are driving this in a top-down way. So they are saying, I have seen the AI light, not usually in some sense, and they've kind of seen the possibilities for the industry, and they are driving this down into the business in terms of saying, right, we are going to either build a key new product normally, which is going to be the AI hero products, and we're going to transform that way. Sometimes we're going to take on more the kind of core operations, but that's the way that they are driving it. And it's top down, which therefore has lots of challenges, but it does mean that they tend to be able to get the initial experiment signed off to some level. So if you like, that's the kind of, I think, the first big wave. And if you've been around big companies over the last 18 months, you'll have seen a lot of the kind of results of the Sea Captain project. There is another kind, right? So there are a bunch of people that we're calling pirates in the best sense possible. So there are people that are inside either the technology function or the marketing function who've managed to create enough space for themselves to carve out a project, maybe to build a product in a different way, or to make some aspect of customer service operate in a different way. And they have a different set of challenges. So it can be that they are managing to corral the resource, at least in the sense of people. So they're able to start making something real happen, but they're doing quite a lot of it without permission, which is both a positive behavior in an innovation sense, but it also brings another barrier. And I think this almost being, because of the way that the AI buzz is rolled out, you can almost see these sort of the effects of this rolling out across most of the sectors and certainly the companies that we're working in. So in terms of initially, there was a bunch of big headline, big investments behind schemes that was very much led by the sea captains, which sounds fantastic at the start. And about now, across lots of different companies, you're hearing where this starts to hit barriers, because what those people need to do is surround themselves with people who actually understand the reality of what's going on, the reality of where technology currently is, the reality of where the barriers are going to be, so that they can start to make some smart choices. And in some level, it's kind of unfortunate if you're a sea captain, because it tends to be that they've had so much energy to kind of see where the industry is going to go, but the gap in between that vision and the reality is quite significant, and there's lots of things they need to do to, make the efforts they've made so far worthwhile. And on the flip side, you have these pirates who tend to take a bit longer to get going, or certainly a bit longer to get anything that's launched in the outside world, so the rest of us can start to hear about it, but are starting to make things happen. So it's going to top down and bottom up within organizations.
If you like content like this about how to build AI products, please remember to subscribe to us on your favorite channel, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. And if you have any questions, please find us on LinkedIn at Design of AI. And to get more articles, insights, and resources, find us on Substack.
This Design of AI episode is brought to you by PH1, a research and strategy consultancy that helps clients build AI products that customers want. Contact them about product discovery research to answer critical questions about what to build, competitive analysis to find out how to gain an advantage, service and customer analysis to identify the best use cases and value drivers, and workshops and concept testing to validate what will work and to fine-tune products. PH1 has worked on products for Spotify, Microsoft, the National Football League, Dell, Mozilla, Bell, and various health and higher education groups. Bring in an expert to make sure your products and teams are focused on what customers want. Visit their website to book an intro call, ph1.ca.
What we've been hearing is that leadership have been getting a lot of pressure to build out some sort of AI capabilities. It might be a survival thing, it might be a competitive thing, or it might just be a buzz thing. Hard to know, but clearly from a leadership standpoint, AI gives an opportunity to implement some efficiency measures. It also gives an opportunity to bring in some new revenue channels or increase productivity. Obviously, there's a range of things that we can do with technology right now.
Yeah, but although I also think there's a context there, which is there's a lot of companies under investor pressure right now because in most parts of the world, we're either in recession or close to recession. And therefore, there's a lot of investors who are saying, how the hell am I going to get return on the investment that I've made in this company based on the way you're currently set up? And what's happened is that a lot of leadership teams have promised that one of the ways they can square the circle is AI, because AI means that essentially we can cut our costs and we can also either keep doing the thing we've been doing, or we can also have a kind of slightly shinier version of it. And I think that is the scenario which is hardest. If you're listening to this podcast and you're in that scenario where a leadership team have promised the AI bubble as a way of doing cost cutting very quickly, that's where it's really tricky. But I do also think there will be some pirates listening to this podcast as well who've spotted something that's going on in their industry and have managed to make something real. So there are, and I do see, we'll talk about that more later on. I do meet a lot of these teams who've started to sort of mobilize something and get quite far with it in a slightly, in a format that's lacking permission. And there's different challenges that come through. But I think it's a really interesting point because I think AI is both being used as the kind of corporate excuse. And it's also, at the very same time, it can also be true that it's a big possibility for lots of companies too.
If you look back the last 10, 15 years, we had a lot of innovation teams trying to transform and disrupt from the inside, but most of them generally failed, right? A lot of the innovation labs ended up getting cut. I'm wondering, are you seeing any examples that indicate that this moment in innovation is different in some form?
To a certain extent, unfortunately, that's the history of innovation. I was quite taken with an article that came out because I've got these two sides to my working life because I work, commercially through Label Sessions. So the Label Sessions itself also has an art sessions service. So we work with arts organizations around the world on what's the future for them and connecting them to experts. But and also myself, I'm involved with a gallery and various other things. And there's a great article that came out last week from Art Week Berlin, and it's talking about the use of AI in art and such like. But there's a great phrase in it, which is the history of art is the history of rejection. And the history of new things is the history of rejection. As people try things, they get told it's stupid for a while. There might be a hype cycle, Gartner kind of, and if you're closer to the investment world, you sometimes can benefit from the hype cycle more, but there's always a moment where the barriers to implementation short-term or doing something useful short-term really become apparent. And people start to therefore doubt the whole story. And there's certain people, which is kind of the pirate mentality, that kind of push on through that, either because they can see it's all going to turn good in the end, or because they're just that type of personality, which I increasingly, the more I do things around innovation, I realize it's a personality type in many ways that want to keep on pushing through to try and prove this thing is possible. And the idea that they had is worth getting into the world. And then afterwards, sometimes they post-rationalize it and say that was good for my career or that was good for my bank balance in some way. But actually, I think it's something that's inside people sometimes that goes, actually, I'm going to push this on.
So again, thinking about the sea captain analogy, if I'm on one of those teams and my mandate is to build the ship for this captain, how do I know what the characteristics are of a winning sea captain? And how can I identify if maybe the ship has no captain at all?
So in terms of the most effective sea captains will realize as they go through, there's loads of things they don't know. And sometimes they haven't anticipated some of the challenges that come up. Now that, if you're the sea captain, if you're leading the charge, is kind of an interesting learning curve for you to go to. If you're in their teams, then it's more of a challenge because it means that inevitably, whilst I think a lot of us would like to work for the leader who's the kind of all-seeing leader who knows all these things coming through. It's like the president in the West Wing. Everyone would like to work in that West Wing where the president's already worked. He's already one step ahead all the time. The reality is, especially in this area, that the sea captains can't be one step ahead. Nobody really quite knows where we're going. And to some level, I think that's an interesting thing as well for lots of people who spent their career talking about digital transformation. Because digital transformation, we kind of really had the model of what a digital organization was. And, if you look back in the writing and the books, maybe even a couple of years ago, it was very much, hey, person, you're running a bank, you want to make that bank more like Facebook, maybe a bit more like Google. But, you kind of had the model of what we're going to. In the AI case, we don't really have a strong vision of what the organization looks like after AI, so to speak. So we're kind of learning. We're not quite sure what we're moving through to. So I think the best thing you can do if you're inside an organization just now is to take on a bit more of that pirate mindset and to say, actually, within my domain, what is the thing that I think I can credibly make in this area? And how can I try to navigate it so I create the right environment for us to do this thing? I think that's the only way you can really go forward. And I think it's also the best way creatively to do things, because as you'll all know, and anyone who's doing anything in this kind of space will know, the devil's in the detail. And also lots of the key things that decide whether this idea is going to fly, whether this product's even going to work, is when you really get into the messy middle, I guess. And that's both in terms of making things technically work. It's also because all the time in this area, you're pressing up against some legal or regulatory barrier. Always, even in terms of customer data and the management of it and all these kind of things, everyone's facing into these elements at different times. So I think all that we can realistically do is to focus down on a product we think we can build or a feature we think we can build, be honest with ourselves around the kind of environment that we need to make that happen, the kind of people that we need to find a way to get around ourselves to make that happen, and focus down on that area.
Let's talk about the risk of not bringing your pirate self to these types of projects. What are some examples of just poorly thought out AI initiatives that you've seen rush through to win some buzz or to, win some investor favor?
There's a whole range of things here. The one that's really close to me, because I ran a consultancy before that was acquired by a big consultancy. And I think there are potentially quite high profile things that will go wrong in the consulting sector as they embrace it. And I'll not necessarily just blaming them, but I see KPMG in the UK issued a press release the other day about how they were deploying AI across their whole workforce and making it mandatory to deploy in different types of projects and things. And I think there's an interesting thing there where there is bound to be a data breach as a result, like in terms of with none of the tools are mature enough to do some of the things we're doing with them in kind of the enterprise consulting services sector. I think the other thing as well, which all of us will see just as consumers, is that the adoption of Gen AI into marketing communications has been handled really badly so far. It's almost only makes sense in the knowledge of the buzz that there is in the kind of internally in a corporation, because there is straightforwardly bad copy that's hitting consumers quite a lot just now, which I think is a key barrier. And I would say as well, the sector that I think has had a biggest issue with getting its head around what AI can do and what AI can't do is the drinks industry, which is interesting in terms of, so I'm based out of Edinburgh, so I'm very close to the whiskey industry and things here. It's interesting in the sense of this is the same sector that got into mess essentially around Web3 a couple of years ago, and has done exactly the same thing in AI around this thing of actually in an industry where so much of, well, essentially all that they own is brands, then convince themselves that there's a way of certainly making lots of content. That's the whole Gen AI kind of thing, but without really knowing what the idea is behind it or how to execute it well. So I think those are the kind of problem spaces just now, which is one, deployment into staff teams in the consulting environment when it's not yet mature enough to do it. And then sectors like drinks, which have convinced themselves that the fact we can now produce more content necessarily makes it better.
Yeah, absolutely. Flip side. What are some examples that you've seen
Positives.
of noteworthy, innovative, and brand building uses of AI that you've been really excited by?
Yeah, exactly. Because I am actually really positive about this. I was saying before, like there are barriers and there are challenges, but I think it is a hugely exciting time. I think one of the things that's really interesting is that a lot of the really exciting use cases currently are to some degree in the less glamorous spaces. So one of the launches just a couple of weeks ago was a thing called Mosaic from Sabre, who we do work with. But Sabre are a travel tech company, so they run booking systems. And their Mosaic platform essentially uses AI to make huge amounts of that process work much better. Some of which, if you look at the wider communication around it, is very future facing in the true sense, the sort of thing that gets into Wired magazine in terms of how you can personalize travel experiences to consumers in a totally new way. But a lot of it is actually how you can make lots of different systems speak together in a really fluent way, which is actually what means it will be easier for people to travel around the world and to make their experience much better. Because that's actually, I think, one of the things where there is lots of kind of executive hallucination around what the capabilities of AI is going to be in the here and now and how quickly it will get there. But what it can already do in a really interesting way is make systems speak together, either by management of data and that kind of system, but also literally through doing things like form filling and changing the formats of different information and such like. That's where it actually can be really useful. So I think Sabre Mosaic is a really interesting example of that on the more commercial side. And then the other kind of side of my personality, I also think in many ways, the most exciting users of AI tech right now are artists rather than futurists. And there's loads of examples that are around that. There's an artist called Brendan Dawes. I'd really encourage people to have a look at some of his work as he shares that online. And then one of the interesting examples, a thing called synthetic memories, which I think actually originates in Canada, but using people's memories of history for which for things where there isn't an image, and then using AI to generate images in response. I do think there are some really interesting ideas and patterns, and that we can both be excited about what in the sense of what they show about the future, but also in terms of actually how we can use the technology to do previously impossible things now.
Funny enough, you brought up travel tech, and Brittany and I, our first project where we worked together was back in 2016. It was a travel tech. It was called Resort.ai, and our goal here was to use machine learning and algorithms and free AI to connect the disparate systems that are hoteliers, hospitality, and such. The truth is, it failed. And a big part of it was, the core of it was the technology wasn't ready, but the technology wasn't ready because the people weren't ready. They didn't want those systems interconnected. So ultimately, as a tech company, you're basically selling smoke and mirrors, hoping that the technology and the people want to catch up with you. How would you consult, today a client team to help them figure out if they're ready to make this kind of big digital transformation, what you'd watch out for, what kind of process you would leverage? Would you encourage these orgs to use a top-down perspective or something a little different?
I think this speaks to another thing in terms of how we do innovation now. Because actually, one of the things I learned most from in our work is we use the expert network as mentors to people, and you hear some of those conversations happening. Those teams who are making the most progress on AI, the reality is the way that you explore the idea is to make it. And I think one of the things that happens a lot for those of us that come from a kind of design thinking background is we have this big kind of rehearsal state, which means that maybe a little bit in that example, maybe in the Resort AI example, everyone articulates what the future version is. And then in a classic design thinking approach, you then start to pull off individual features as you go through. And it's quite late in the process before you get to a point where you realize, actually, for this to work, you would need everything to integrate in a way that they both don't do currently and have lots of vested interests and why they don't want things to necessarily integrate quite as easily as you were imagining they would do. Whereas I think one of the interesting things now is the fact that actually there's quite often ways you can start to actually build out the thing, or at least a small version of the thing, and start to get it working and start to see what the real issues are. And we're seeing that really directly just now in terms of we've got a bunch of projects where we're connecting people who are kind of pioneers in this kind of field and teams that are pretty much building out a first version of what their brands might be, or rather than doing a kind of proof of concept where none of the technology really operates, actually having something that's real and operational. And by making it, you therefore find there's lots of things you need to do before you make it launch to market. there's always those things. You see that first version, you can say, actually, is the nature of that bet that we're waiting, that we think that the engine itself is going to become vastly more sophisticated by a certain point? Is it that there's actually things we need to do in our back end? That's what I talked about data structure and things before. That there are things that we need to do that enable this whole thing? Or are there things in terms of adoption, either by partners or by consumers, that we need to change? So there's something quite fundamental in thinking and making, rather than these quite complicated innovation processes we've maybe become quite used to in the past.
So to that point, one of our past guests, Ben Yoskovich, he's from a venture studio in Toronto. He was saying that, it was a strong piece of advice, which was basically there's so many entrepreneurs who want to tackle problems where the problem is so ingrained that it's unsolvable. Now, but the point of that is, there's a technocratic view here that you can just throw a technology in, everyone's going to adopt it, huzzah, to win. But his perspective is that so many of the problems are actually driven by human and organizational self-interest. And until you address those incentive, emotional needs, you're not going to be able to overcome core problem that's at the basis of it. But the other thing is that organizations naturally are siloed. And again, that's the incentive scheme usually within the organization. Hierarchy, it's the responsibilities within things. I wonder if there's any other advice that you have for some of these teams that quite literally are being asked to boil the ocean and go outside of their comfort zone.
And I think it's also what I was talking about before, which is there's things you control and things you can't control. So right now there are, I guess if you're being positive, we can call them the sea captains in the previous examples. There are leaders who have an interest essentially in selling a version of AI, which is not where AI currently is. And it's quite often because on the flip side, that's why I'm suspicious sometimes when people say, oh, but we're deploying all these AI tools because our investors say we have to deploy AI tools. Because my sense of whenever I've been in investor meetings is investors are into those kind of things, but they're mostly into the commercial returns on the investment that they've made. And so actually this kind of AI word has been used as the bauble at some point to describe why this business isn't working. It's going to work in some form. So I think there's a thing where if you are the type of person who's trying to make an innovation happen, there's something in your personality where you will not just throw your hands up where other people might throw their hands up. But there is a piece right now where we need to be kind to ourselves to some level and say, actually, okay, within this environment, what is the thing that I think I can realistically make? How can I turn around to the business and show them that this thing is of value, either in the sense of it's going to launch and be successful, or even just now it's going to help us tell a story of the change that's coming to the fore. But I think that's the reality of what being an innovation leader is to some extent. It's both being able to drive change and make things happen within your teams, but it's also being able to create the environment where you and your team can have impact and can go on working on that challenge. So I think that's the embracing your pirate side.
Last week, we had this super fascinating designer on from Klaviyo. You should definitely take a listen to it. She dives into the experience of moving from a traditional product org kind of model to building AI products. And one of the most fascinating things she said is that it is the first time in her career where she didn't really know what direction to sail in. If we look at the pirate analogy or the sea captain analogy, they didn't know where they were going. So they built a ship. They didn't know if it was the right ship. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know if they'd survive, right? If we want to take that analogy at play. But ultimately, the point here is there's no best practices. There's no precedence. So you really have to take a very intrepid mindset as an organization in terms of the riskiness of it, in terms of the directions you may need to go, but also as a leader or a team member that you just need to figure it out for yourself, focus on your core skills. It means that there's a lot of people existing in this time of uncertainty, and they need to add new things to their toolkit. What do you recommend that they can do to help focus themselves on the uncertainty, on the direction, and to overcome it? What do you recommend that these people can do as they sail into this really uncharted territory? What can they learn from previous innovation type moments or toolkits?
I think there's two things that are really valuable on that. So one of which is, I was saying before, so many people have been brought up through an era of digital transformation, which did have this quite kind of clear sense of what the end goal was. It might not be very much what in Google and Facebook themselves turned into very different types of companies, but what was this kind of vision of what a digital company was going to be that you had to transfer things over to. And you also had these kind of clear case studies from a design perspective of what good looked like in terms of, the kinds of experience you were trying to create, which we don't have in AI. And I think also we are still to think through what the really successful design patterns are going to be. So I was talking just this week with a team who are working on a kind of fintech finance product. And I think one of the things that's really interesting in terms of the way that AI has been applied to fintech and banking products and such like so far, limited though it is, but you kind of seen these different examples come out. And what everyone's doing is they're kind of repeating the old model. So in the kind of pure digital transformation world, you were kind of taking a bank and you're sticking it on a screen and trying to make that experience work. And that's led into people creating AI tools that say, hey, look, on this screen now, we can analyze your money in a host of new ways. And we can make graphs that kind of give you more insight into things in a whole bunch of new ways. Which actually is missing the point. Because I think the actual point of this is to make services that take the effort away. So why do I even need to look at my money in those scenarios? Because I can tell it what my kind of goals are and what I want to do. And then when there's more money in one place, can you put it somewhere that's sensible? And when there's less, can I kind of start to move things around? And can I change habits in different ways? And so, yeah, it's a really interesting thing just now, which is we do need to go back to first principles if we're actually going to embrace stuff. That is a real challenge. And that's where, I was talking about the phrase before, the history of art is a history of rejection. Some of that does mean sometimes coming back with a slightly unpopular message for a second, because it is saying, actually, there are things we can do with AI, but should we? And actually, on the flip side, how do these new models that are coming forward allow us to think about things in a very different way and therefore produce a very different type of product and a very different type of experience for people?
It's obvious that AI can add a lot of value operationally. Like that's 95% of the use cases being driven right now. It can simplify processes. It can make things more efficient. That's fantastic. But, a lot of these initiatives, the hope is that it pushes the brand forward, that there's some consumer investor facing component. What are some characteristics that you've seen of an exceptional use of AI to build brand?
I think the use case for Sabre Mosaic that I mentioned before is that it will enable travel brands of all kinds to build their brands in really useful ways. The reason that will be difficult for lots of designers in those organizations is the way it will build those brands is because the brand will actually be able to say much less. And I think this is the really interesting challenge. Before, when I was talking about the fact that I see a lot of really bad copy being generated by different brands and coming into my email inbox, into my social ads, is that clearly the technology enables you to generate much more, which they will be justifying in their head as brand building. Whereas I think the new way for us to think about brand building is to say, well, actually, how can we turn up in consumers' lives in some ways, maybe less often, but when we do in a really distinctive way and in a really useful way that builds the positive association. And I think, by the way, the really unpopular industry that will be the pioneer of this is gambling. And that's going to come in Europe because at the same time as you have the AI revolution happening, you also have affordability checks coming in much more. So the way they're kind of regulating the industry, people need to prove that they can afford the money they're spending on gambling. I think that industry realizes that if they try and deploy that using the design patterns of recent years, that it's going to create a massive amount of friction. There's no matter in terms of how many beautifully designed screens you can stick up in that instance or how much you customize the experience. You're just going to be a pain point. So I do think that will be one of the early adopters of an industry that says, actually, inevitably, this experience we need to design to get someone to connect up their banking app to us in some way. But beyond that, actually, how can we be really smart in terms of how we communicate and how we turn up and how we kind of create an experience that isn't just about driving people into looking at our logo, but is actually about how we can craft an experience that takes you through a transaction, but does that in a way where we're adding value, or at least we're taking away effort from compared to anyone else in the market.
I'd love to know a bit more about this gambling example because it really brings to light the core question with AI, which is the more interconnected the systems are, the more capabilities it has, the more ability it has to deliver value. but it also raises the creepy factor. There's more data breach risk. There's more of your personal information floating out there. But again, the holistic system is the ultimate goal of this. This is why an OpenAI or an Apple want to be that system of record. Can you speak a bit more to what you're seeing in these sorts of circumstances?
There's a huge amount around that. I mean, the other area as well, and the other area that's interesting is death tech. I used to run a Substack on death tech because I thought it was really interesting in terms of everyone's customers die, but I'd never met a board that had a plan for it or did it very well, frankly, in terms of actually when some of my customers died, they kept on sending them marketing or all kinds of instances where they just no boards wanted to talk about it. But now with AI, you see these tools coming through. They're very much on the creepy tech angle where they're saying, actually, well, we can look at someone's emails and we can therefore have a version of your loved one that can interact with you and all these kind of things. And the thing that's really scary about that is it's a horrendous design pattern, deeply unauthentic. Those companies are getting a surprising level of traction already. So in terms of if you go and look at them, they're quite successful already, even though the experience they offer is very limited. New tech is all about how people use it. And I think that there are a bunch of scandals are coming. And it's interesting in terms of I am picking up a lot more interest in things like AI ethics and such because I think a lot of companies themselves are realizing that they're getting into a space they don't really understand or certainly are not comfortable with in terms of how we use this information. But I think these use cases are going to be really key. The reason I'm pausing is I don't think there's an easy answer to it. The other thing the example I always have in my mind is whenever we talk about these new areas of technology, people say, oh, we imagine the customer pushback that we're going to get in these areas. And the example I always get to people is plugs. If you imagine you were trying to sell plugs in your house to people as a new technology, you'd have to say, they're really ugly. They require people literally putting holes in the walls across your house. And if someone were to ask the question, what happens if my kids stick their fingers in them? You'd go, oh, well, they'll get electrocuted and they'll probably die, or at least they'll get hurt. That would be a hard sell. But the reality is people like lights and they like ovens and they like all the things that electricity brings, right? And so I suspect that what's going to happen is consumer adoption of these things will be much quicker than all of us that are close to the sector are comfortable with, because the advantages of some of these services will be quite quick. And in the gambling example, I think is interesting when you've got a regulation happening. So it's going to happen. Consumers across markets like the UK and elsewhere in Europe are going to have to do this thing when they log into their gambling app. They're going to have to prove that they can afford to stake the wager, to spend the money. Now, there'll be a point when they have companies that are not using the scary tech, but are requiring them to go off and log into the banking app and then to kind of put in some details and then to do various different calculations or something like that. And there'll be the other guys who have got this thing where you click a couple of buttons, it goes and it seems to do something to do with your bank account, and then it comes back with a different model and it asks you a question and then you're good to go. It's a real issue in terms of understanding the way that AI is going to be regulated. There's both AI and there's also other regulations it will touch. So, for instance, one of the things in the UK environment is we have open banking, which in the gambling case will be important because we have the ability for different companies to, in a very secure way, access elements of your banking history and transaction history and these types of things for security purposes. Now, that will be really important for lots of AI tools that get developed. Now, regulators in that space will start to get interested as soon as people are using their technology and the environment they've created for that use case, and will start to have opinions around these things. That's a key thing that's going to happen over the next 18 months or so, is AI will start getting regulated by non-AI regulators, you see what I mean? Because they'll start to look at, is this an appropriate use of the technology or the service, or, also are the institutions that I regulate operating in this way? Because it all comes off data, and data fundamentally is already regulated. I think people will have to get their head around that.
One of the promises
Yes.
of generative AI that is believed to be very revolutionary is around the creative process. And you mentioned a couple of examples from the art world and projects, so Brendan Davies and Synthetic Memories. But can you maybe share some more examples where you've seen generative AI leveraged in an exceptional creative way?
And music is really interesting on this. And actually, it was a few years ago, I was involved myself in a project called Living Symphonies. There was a symphonic piece of music generated by the natural environment itself. So each element took place in a forest. You could walk through the forest, and everything that was alive in that forest had a sound attached to it, essentially, usually by individual instruments. And as those things interacted with each other, a piece of music would be generated in real time. And there's lots of examples of that kind of idea in music. And in the pure art use case, there have been pieces of music that have been designed in responses to how angry people are on Twitter, to lots of things in terms of natural ecosystems, to traffic, both online and in the physical world. And it's interesting because if you like, that whole scene or generative music was initially a pure art world thing, was people just trying to see this as a way of making interesting music and also a way of helping people interact with the world in a different way. Because once you listen to it, you start to realize, actually, it's surprising how many things are alive in the forest. I just saw the trees and the grass before, but there's a lot more things going on with all these things. So it kind of comes from a pure art world idea. But then more recently, that has been applied directly into gaming and therefore into an industrial application, because all of a sudden in the gaming world, you need music for all the different eventualities that happen in a game, in a modern game, which is a whole world, essentially. You need to have different music that creates different sense of suspense or whatever else. That kind of generative AI in an art sense is just a really interesting thing. There's those examples in the music world, which are very much Gen AI doing a thing that we still recognize as music, a song, a symphony. One of the things that's interesting with Brendan Dawes and elsewhere is they're actually making artwork that is made through AI. They're just making a beautiful thing, loving the fact that it's come through that process, which I think is also an interesting thing. So I think those use cases are really interesting.
I love it. I just love the enthusiasm with which you're talking about this space, and clearly, there's so much opportunity. If we were to ground it, because, in this podcast, we're really trying to speak to people that are building product, but also people that are working in agencies or working in companies where they need to utilize these tools for the creative process. So let's say I'm an agency. How should I be leveraging generative AI for the creative process or otherwise?
I'm on the board of a traditional agency as well, apart from the label sessions thing. And one of the things I talk to them about is, on one level, it's really simple, which is how can you get the most remarkable creative people in your team to be able to do that more and more, and to do that on a bigger scale. And that's what the kind of the positive side of Gen AI is. And also, how can you take away all the stuff either that they're not that good at or that they're average at? And that kind of simple principle, I actually think it is really interesting on that front. So I think one of the areas which I think AI is already quite revolutionary is customer research. So even if you record qualitative customer interviews, you can now get a host of different things, even if you're using really kind of open, uncustomized tools. So in terms of, there was a project recently, was involved with just using Fireflies, if you like, which everyone can subscribe to Firefly. And it had a set of about 25 to 30 depth interviews. And one of the simplest things you can do around that was that went through a whole host of different topics, each interview, in terms of how they felt about this particular company, about the product, about competitors, about things that were going on in their financial lives at the time. And one, you could start to cross-cut the conversations around those topics in a really interesting way. You could get sentiment analysis alongside what they were saying rationally, but also how those things kind of combined in terms of what they seem to be feeling about a topic and what they were saying about a topic. They could look at different keywords. You could cut this in different ways. And in particular, you could give access to that to both the core team of research specialists and also to the people working more directly on the product application. And that can be there as a kind of resource for everybody involved in that product. So there's lots of things which are still to be fixed in terms of how we rebuild all of our creative processes. But I just think it's really interesting in terms of customer research already. We can now get a depth of insight from qualitative research that we might once have only got from quantitative surveys that were kind of big, cumbersome things to go through. And actually, I mentioned this slightly before, but there's a musician in our network, Pat Kane, who's, like a much more of a pop musician than some of the other people I've been talking about before. But he talks really interestingly around this thing in terms of the way it's changed his creative process on the basis that it has essentially reduced or in some ways removed the traditional rehearsal process. So when he's now looking at making a different type of music, whereas before we would have to go through this cycle of learning what the codes of that particular type of music are, maybe learning a different instrument a different way, he can now start to be making a piece of music from the start and iterating and going forward in that way. And I think that's also what's interesting from an agency standpoint, which is actually how can you get the most remarkable people in that setting who really know a particular domain.
Creatives, there's some very clear advantages of leveraging AI. What if I'm a strategist, let's say a business strategist or product strategist? How would you recommend that I leverage these Gen AI tools in my processes?
There's a lot of stuff that's written now around, using AI as the first draft. And I think that probably is one of the things that's exciting from an AI in terms of the use of AI for strategists. And I think one of the things that's interesting within that, which I can spot myself as well, is it makes you rethink what's valuable about your own skills. So I think in particular for people that have been trained from a strategy background, a lot of the way you used to demonstrate impact was when someone sort of would raise a particular question, you would go, well, I've got a bunch of models for that. Whereas one of the great things that AI does is it makes lots of those models really available to all kinds of different people, because even the basic models, so you can go and say, how should I think about different ways a brand can differentiate? And it will give me, 4 different ways of doing that and visualizing that in different ways. So, I mean, again, a bit like I was saying in the wider agency setting, I think the key thing that AI has already done, if you embrace it, is to allow you to reduce the amount of time purely on giving models for things and purely on generating a set of questions to ask in a customer research interview, and more therefore on the kind of higher level tasks in terms of how can I sense where something interesting is in that interview, or how can I can very quickly choose the right models, but how can I start to get to the core of what is the biggest idea in there? So, I guess in terms of the key thing that I've spotted using it myself, but also watching different strategists and leaders use AI tools, is when it's used best, it should allow you to focus down on the thing that you're exceptional, the element of it you're exceptional about with, and minimize as much of the rest of it as possible.
To that point, I'm someone that typically operates in that strategy zone. And one of the things I'd be very interested in is the idea of the agent, because quite often, as a strategist or consultant, you're thrown into projects and you have to learn exceptionally fast. You're onboarded through 1 or 2 people and they institute a bit of a bias and, a tunnel vision to what it is. An agent can de-risk that in some respects because it can give you a holistic perspective on how an org operates, gives you more direct access to things, can funnel you to answers. The agent perspective fascinates me.
There's also like a thing I've suggested people implement, and they've done it in different systems, so it's positive. If you're running a project and there's meetings that you don't go to, hopefully stand-ups that do unless you're a power freak. It's a really simple thing which you can do in most of these tools now, which is ask the agent to let you know when sentiment changes in a meeting. It's really powerful because it means that actually, especially in remote teams, when somebody may not have told you, I'd suggested to someone that they do it, and then I met them a bunch of weeks later, and he got a notification while we were speaking. And what it told him was that in the development stand-up, so where the actual developers were, sentiment had changed a lot in the last couple of days. Now, it wasn't doing the creepy thing of like telling him precisely what the argument had been, whatever, but he knew, okay, that's a scrum master I need to go and check in with. And a couple of days later, he just WhatsApped me going, yep, it turned out that those estimations were totally wonky. But there's really interesting things just in terms of really light touch, I think, that you can start to tell. And also, it's interesting as a self-learning activity, some of these things, purely because it's just quantified different things. So I have noticed myself, for instance, as you might have picked up, I do speak quite a lot. And I've set up one myself that just points out if there's been a meeting where I've been speaking more than 50% of the time, which can happen. And I just get a little note to say that happened. So it is interesting in terms of, whilst I think it's just the nature of AI, we talk lots about the big possibilities and therefore get frustrated when they're not there, or talk about the shortcomings in terms of it's not yet in a place where we can quite deliver all of the open AI demos across all of our organizations. That's unfortunately not quite the case. But it is also already a really interesting thing, and it can also already really make you better at the thing that you do, I think.
I love that advice to get an alert when sentiment changes, because that can happen so quickly. And I personally have had, especially in my past life working in agencies, where sentiment would change and you don't know why or when, and it will sneak up on you. Are there specific AI products, so like Fireflies, but are there any AI products that you're loving right now? Or any that you feel will transform business workflows?
Well, it's unfortunate because I've already mentioned it, and I'm trying not to here, so I could say Fireflies, but I am a big fan of Fireflies, partly because both things like its sentiment analysis is really good, but also the APIs are quite easy to build on. I'm excited by these things where it kind of gets it beyond the labs, if you like, and the very sophisticated teams, and starts to create other models. So I think that one of the biggest impacts that AI can have in the short term, if you're introducing it into a new team, so the best mature team with a new team, is the fact that once you have the meeting notes, a thing like Fireflies, what it actually takes out immediately from your team is the need to write everything down. And you realize how much time in lots of organizations is essentially writing things down. Actually, there was a community group, essentially, I introduced that to just a couple of weeks ago. And they'd had that experience where you realized they always had to get someone to volunteer to make the notes. And then they had to kind of go through the actions, and they had this whole thing. And actually, that's again an example where a really simple application of the technology starts to change the way that people work together. I think there's the first draft internally, and then I think the other really useful pattern around all these things, which is, kind of around this thing I was talking about in terms of the effort negative. How can the technology actually take out the negative? I'm really interested in AI around people's best intentions and sustainability, therefore, which is one of our areas. Because I'm quite interested in the pattern of AI as a way that you put in your kind of narrative self, so the version of yourself in terms of here's what my rules are and how I want to behave in certain instances. And then the way that the tools can then start to present different choices to you as you go through. So one of the key things I'm interested in alongside, in the kind of whole travel space, we talked about Sabre Mosaic and things before, is actually AI specifically in the business travel use case. So actually, once you've got companies that have signed up to reducing impact in a certain way, and you've got the knowledge, which is now a data point in terms of where people need to go, how important those different sessions are, and such like how we can actually design responses around those things. And then the other really creative space, which I've been telling everyone about, which is lots of people in the tech press and the AI world talk lots about the applications to medicine. That's one of the big things they always talk about. Drug discovery, massively exciting in terms of the statistics and how important that is. That's fantastic. But I cannot see it being allowed to work in the way that we do treatment and diagnosis for humans for a very, very long time, which is why I think the big opportunity is vets. I think one of the really interesting opportunities will be the way you can actually take health data on animals and start to present very different types of products. If I was looking for a creative use case, I think veterinary science is one of the areas I would look at.
And Nick, what's the best way for someone to follow along with your adventures, label sessions, or otherwise? Where can they find you online?
I've always historically been quite a big user of Twitter. It's gradually becoming more and more toxic, so I'm trying to move over to TikTok. So between those two.
Such a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. The show is hosted by Brittany Hobbs and Arpi Drag-Figueredo. Subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple to get our latest episodes. We speak to leaders at the forefront of AI to learn how great AI products are designed and how they're transforming industries. To contact us, visit our website, designof.ai.